means we're going to have access. We're going to have that on our website at a later date, so it can be viewed at any time following these sessions. With us today, we have Dr. Jake Veasey. He is one of our advisors on the bear care group, so we're very happy to have him here today to talk about bear welfare. And with that, Jake, I'm going to pass it off to you. So we have plenty of time for questions and stuff as we go along.
Good. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Just want to check that you can all see that opening screen. Angela, I can't hear you, so I'm assuming you can.
Yep, you're good to go.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks for everyone for joining this meeting, and thanks to the Bear Care Group for inviting me to speak here. The presentation I'm going to do might be a little bit different from some of the other speakers. Rather than focusing on specifics of how to go about providing great welfare for your bears, I want to go back to basics a little bit and talk about what welfare is, because there are stunningly wide variations in health. And I think this has a massive impact upon how we end up delivering welfare for all of our animals, and including bears, of course. Ultimately, I hope you'll be able to take away some of the insights that will help you to advance the welfare of your bears, or at worst, confirm you're on the right track. I'll give you a very quick summary about my background. I'm a behavioral ecologist and welfare scientist, and for the past 20 years, I've been trying to use those insights to optimize both conservation and welfare strategies as a director of zoos and aquariums, but also as a consultant to government, zoos, sanctuaries, and NGOs really across the world. And in that time, I've witnessed wildly different conceptions as well of welfare. It's really motivated me to promote conceptions that are optimized for animals, because it's not always the case based on what I've witnessed. So I want to start by illustrating the long-term impacts of different approaches to welfare by reviewing some recent history in animal care. Now, following the release of the movie Blackfish, the social license for keeping cetaceans in captivity has pretty much collapsed, with many regions now making it illegal to establish new cetacean facilities. Now, for context, this more recent shift occurred 3 decades after the British government introduced evidence-based standards on cetacean care, which resulted in UK dolphinariums voluntarily phasing cetaceans out of captivity in the UK. Now, considering that precedent, it's astonishing that no one appeared to anticipate this shift. And instead, and it's my personal belief, fairly obvious aspects of species biology were ignored, and instead there was a tendency to focus on defending the status quo by the sector, and facilities argued that they met current best practice standards that were set largely by themselves, and scrabbled for evidence that cetaceans live as long in captivity as they do in the wild, as if that somehow confirmed that they therefore must have good welfare. And a lot of emphasis was placed on veterinary care and the physical realm of animal welfare. Now, at the same time, concerns were being raised about cetaceans in the UK. Similar concerns are also being raised about polar bears. And during the course of the 80s and early 90s, with the cooperation of zoos, 3 evidence-based reports were undertaken by the Universities Federation for Animal Welfare, Born Free Foundation, and others, and again with the full cooperation of zoos. And as a result of these findings, 11 largely urban zoos took the decision to phase the keeping of polar bears out, and 2 new facilities emerged that on average are 20 times bigger than what had previously existed, which allowed that social license to maintain polar bears in captivity to be regained and subsequently to be retained. And for me, this narrative illustrates a clear difference and outcome between a defensive strategy emphasizing physical aspects of care, heavily reliant upon human inputs, which has ultimately failed, to a strategy in which zoos worked with critics, responded to the evidence, and addressed the psychological issues that were discovered in that review process, and had a greater emphasis on environmental opportunities for these animals. And so far, that strategy appears to have succeeded, but will no doubt need to continue to evolve as knowledge grows. So how is it some institutions can get out of step with these shifts in science and public perception, whereas others keep up with that evolution in how we think about welfare? And I think in facilities that are sufficiently resourced and motivated to do the right thing by welfare, I think there are 3 key drivers to that failure of keeping up with shifts in thinking. I think, number 1, facilities might not be as good as they think they are. And there can be a tendency to lack the humility or indeed the confidence to continually question what we do. We can build a fantastic facility 10 or 15 years ago. That doesn't mean to say that in 10 or 15 years time, it's going to meet the new expectations for animal welfare. Perhaps understandably, many institutions perceive animal welfare as a threat, and that pushes institutions towards a defensive position where they're less receptive to insights from welfare advocates, and which ultimately leads to facilities being reactive to shifts in the public mood rather than responding quickly to shifts in our understanding of animal welfare science. And finally, there is likely a discrepancy between how institutions conceive welfare and how animals experience it. Now, again, I want you to have a look at these 2 big cat habitats. They're at the same zoo. They're a century apart. And whilst the aesthetic of these 2 habitats is very different, the welfare of the animals in these 2 facilities is arguably broadly comparable. And I believe this can only really result from flawed conceptions of welfare that are surprisingly widespread across the animal care sector around the world. So I now want to start examining these different conceptions of welfare that exist. So amongst welfare scientists, welfare hedonism is the dominant view. And what we mean by welfare hedonism is that animal welfare relates solely to the presence of positive emotional states and the absence of negative emotional states. So whilst physical well-being is important, if physical well-being doesn't impact the feelings of animals, it doesn't impact their welfare. Now, whilst this is the scientific consensus, this consensus is not universally reflected amongst welfare stakeholders, nor, I believe, amongst animal care staff. There is actually no universally accepted definition of animal welfare, and just 14% of animal welfare stakeholder groups subscribe to the scientific hedonistic consensus on what animal welfare is. And in fact, the majority failed to provide a definition of animal welfare that they subscribe to. And here we see that manifest in the definitions of 3 zoo accrediting bodies and also in the draft Universal Declaration for Animal Welfare. Now, what I've done here is I've highlighted words in green that relate to the psychological well-being of animals, and in red that relate to the physical well-being of animals, so you can kind of pick up the aspects of welfare throughout this presentation quickly. Now, as we see, most of the definitions that are provided, where they are provided, combine physical and psychological components of well-being. And these definitions seem reasonable. They seem logical that, you know, welfare is dependent upon physical and psychological well-being. But I believe they have problematic outcomes, which I'm now going to try and illustrate. But firstly, I want to set that hedonistic view out a little bit more and explain why it's not the dominant conception outside of the arena of welfare science. So again, as we've seen, according to that hedonistic definition of animal welfare is all about feelings. Animals have good welfare when they feel good, and they have bad welfare when they feel bad. Now, health is important, but if health doesn't impact feelings, it doesn't impact welfare. However, we can't measure the feelings of animals directly. We don't share a common language. They can't tell us how they feel. And as a result, we rely on imperfect and indirect indicators of animal welfare, such as abnormal behaviors, stress hormones, and physiological indicators. And I say they're imperfect and indirect. So stereotypic behaviors can remain manifest in animals removed from stressful environments. Stress hormones can be elevated in animals that are excited and depressed in animals that are chronically stressed. So all of these welfare indicators have challenges in our ability to interpret them. By way of contrast, physical health has numerous tangible metrics at the population level and the individual level, from longevity and fecundity to body condition, and even the extent to which we're able to provide health care. And there is this intuitive link between health and welfare. And as a result, it has emerged as arguably the most influential facet of our understanding of animal welfare. But it's really important to understand that health and welfare are not the same, and management for health can actually conflict with welfare. And I'm going to try and illustrate that with some examples from both in and outside of the wild animal arena. Now, the American Veterinary Medical Association, European Union, the UK and Australian governments have all reviewed the welfare of sows in sow stalls, in farrowing crates. And the UK and European Union reviews, which were based around holistic conceptions of welfare, including the affective states of sows, the feelings of these animals, concluded they caused serious welfare problems, and so have implemented a ban for these systems. Now, in marked contrast, the American Veterinary Medical Association and the Australian review of the same systems actually concluded that sow stalls protected welfare because they considered health-centered metrics such as disease, injury, and growth rates. And as a result of that, the American Veterinary Medical Association actually opposed the California Farm Animal Welfare Act, which required farm animals to be able to stand up and turn around. And I just want you all to let that sink in a little. The largest veterinary medical association on the planet objected to legislation requiring farm animals be able to stand up and turn around on welfare grounds. Now, this reflects evidently a conception of welfare where physical priorities take precedent over psychological priorities, which may have its origins in the more challenging nature of assessing physiological, psychological outcomes versus physical ones. But regardless, if policymakers around the world can't agree on welfare measures and impacts, it's not surprising that there are different conceptions of welfare amongst and within apparently good animal welfare facilities. Now, this issue isn't restricted to farm animals, so I want to now consider the impact of prioritizing health on the welfare of one of the most iconic wild animals that we keep regularly in captivity. Now, it's widely accepted that health is a foundation of good welfare, and that nutrition is a foundation of good health. It's central to both the 5 freedoms and 5 domain models. And, you know, perhaps logically, a logical extension of that continuum is this recommendation from the American Association of Zoo Veterinarians that states that whenever possible, the use of species-specific commercially prepared animal diets should form the basis of any nutrition program. Again, so far, this all seems, you know, very logical. But let's consider the impact of that policy on tigers. Now, in the wild, acquiring food for a tiger is about so much more than hunting. There is an extensive appetitive phase that takes up more time and energy than simply killing prey. This includes establishing and maintaining a territory, gathering real-time information on prey density and distribution, as well as monitoring the presence or absence of competitors and potential mates. Stalking, chasing, and killing prey are in comparison relatively brief events, and the motivation to express those behaviors can be eliminated simply by discovering a carcass or the opportunity to steal a meal. Also, it's crucial to understand that in the wild, meals for tigers can be as much as take up as much as 20% of their body weight. And that results in a stomach distension, a satiety, which shuts down that motivation to forage. It's actually that stretching of the stomach that eliminates that motivation to forage. Now, when tigers are managed in captivity, where non-hedonistic views of welfare are applied and which comply with the recommendations of organizations such as the AAZV, it results in feeding regimes that are markedly different from that that's experienced in the wild. And so the feeding of daily chow diets, optimized for a daily feeding regime, they provide for good health, they're consistent, they're balanced, and they remove the risks of tooth breaks and death by choking on bones, etc. But crucially, what they don't do is satisfy or eliminate all of these appetitive behaviors. And because they're provided on a daily basis, they don't eliminate that motivation to forage, which means captive tigers fed chow diets are chronically motivated to forage whilst being prevented to do so from the nature of the environment they're in. And this frustration of such a highly motivated set of behaviors and cognitive processes has a profound impact on the welfare of tigers, and stereotypies are fairly ubiquitous, and zoos are now even designing around stereotypies to turn pacing into an attraction. We can also see this health-centric bias in a review of husbandry manuals. So these are AZA husbandry manuals and a review undertaken in 2017, and just 16% of their content related to psychological components of welfare, despite, again, the scientific consensus stating that these are the very essence of animal welfare. So best practice as we know it certainly has room for improvement. And the challenge in all of this is finding that right balance between those physical and psychological components of care. And I feel in animal care, we face a choice. There is a spectrum of animal management available to us, ranging from intensive management systems to extensive management systems. Now, this is a pig breeding unit. It's an intensive management system where the animals are heavily reliant upon human inputs. Humans have an immense amount of control over the animal's life and its environment. And it maximizes our opportunity to de-risk the lives of those animals from a physical health perspective. Here we see an extensive hill farming situation from the British Isles, where animals are more reliant upon their habitat, which is typically bigger, but it's also important to understand from a welfare perspective. We're not simply, we shouldn't simply get excited about more space and more complexity. These are lazy metrics by which we judge welfare. We need that space and complexity to reflect the species needs. And we see this spectrum in zoos and aquariums as well. So here on the left, we have a amphibian breeding unit that will absolutely help protect these animals from chytrid fungus, whereas the environment on the right, not only can we not guarantee protection for amphibians from chytrid, we can't protect them even from predation. We certainly can't administer individual healthcare. And in fact, these animals are more likely to end up as compost before we even understand what's going on. But clearly that environment, that more complex environment, provides greater psychological opportunities for those animals. And there is evidently a continuum between these two extremes. And I think there is a room for optimism if we can position ourselves on that continuum collectively. Because captivity can be great in protecting the physical well-being of animals. You know, we can de-risk the lives of animals, and typically for most animals that have been kept in captive environments for many years, they typically live longer than they do in the wild because of that ability to de-risk their lives. But captivity is often less good at safeguarding the psychological well-being of animals. Animals are subject to behavioral restriction, frustration, and a lack of choice, boredom, etc. And there is a real tension between these physical and psychological components of care. The more freedoms we allow animals, the less able we are to protect their physical well-being. And I think finding that balance is absolutely fundamental to optimizing welfare. And at the moment, we're not particularly good, I believe, universally at finding that balance, because we tend to focus on the measurable rather than the meaningful. We focus on the more tangible aspects of physical well-being, potentially to the detriment of the psychological well-being of animals. And as a result, we fail to achieve that point of peak welfare where we can maintain the benefits of captivity in terms of physical protection, but also provide for an animal's psychological needs. And the missing ingredient in that is the capacity to identify what those psychological needs are to optimize welfare. So I want to consider this relationship and that tension between physical and psychological priorities in a bit more detail and conceptualize that to help us think about how we go about finding that balance. So again, at one end of the spectrum, we have an intensive environment in which animals benefit from surveillance, environmental stability, maximize healthcare, optimize nutrition, and risk reduction. And the more we shift towards an extensive environment, the more those safeguards are eroded, up to the point that animals are ultimately wild, and those physical safeguards are absolutely removed. However, as we extend towards these more extensive forms of management, we provide greater psychological opportunities for animals. Animals are more reliant upon their environment than they are upon people. And for that to work effectively, that environment needs to be biologically, physically, and socially appropriate to them. And inherent with that is species appropriate environmental complexity and choice and control. And there is this tension between the two. Now, unfortunately, as we've seen, The benefits of protecting physical well-being are more tangible than the psychological opportunities, which encourages us to be conservative and to prioritize those physical safeguards. When in fact, welfare is likely to peak when we place greater emphasis on an animal's psychological well-being. And the reason for that is because challenges to physical well-being are typically short-lived. If animals are sick, they either get better or they die, whereas compromises to animals' psychological well-being will be lifelong. And so in optimizing welfare, we potentially need to sacrifice some aspects of physical well-being and provide a greater emphasis on psychological opportunities. But what I don't think we need to do, and what this graph hopefully helps illustrate, is sacrifice all of those physical safeguards. And so when we don't need to, and we shouldn't attempt to replicate nature, but actually just find those aspects inherent in nature that are fundamental to an animal's welfare. And that's a challenge, you know, to understand, for example, the relative importance of these two very natural behaviors, are both normal natural behaviors. We would need to use consumer demand theory with extensive experimental setups, which is rarely possible for wild animals in zoos. And that's just two behaviors. You know, when trying to evaluate the relative importance of behaviors for wild animal species, we have to consider many, many more behaviors. So those experimental approaches are not possible. So how do we go about attempting to understand the relative importance of behaviors and cognitive processes? And I want to use these two examples to kind of illustrate the process that I've developed to undertake that. So we are looking for cues that indicate to us that this behavior is likely to be important. So food acquisition for this tiger is of high survival value, and arguably even of more high survival value is the importance for that wild boar in escaping being eaten. They're both highly motivated behaviors. There's this relationship between the evolutionary significance of behaviors and their motivation, the strength of their motivation. That's how evolution encourages animals to do things that make sense from an evolutionary perspective. So there's a relationship between evolution, motivation, and animal welfare, because if we frustrate highly motivated behaviors, the compromise to welfare is proportional to that frustration, which is proportional to that evolutionary significance. Now we start to see a bit of a divergence. As we've seen in tigers, the acquisition of food is more about than just simply hunting. So all of the appetitive behaviors associated with acquiring food are of long duration, whereas the chase events are typically very short, 10, 15 seconds, they're of short duration. Food acquisition is a regular and typically frequent part of these animals' lives, whereas having to escape being chased from a predator they're not just short, but they're irregular and they're infrequent. And crucially, that motivation to go out looking for food, for seeking food, comes from within the animal. But the desire to escape a tiger is only triggered by the perception of a tiger. And as a result, behaviors associated with food acquisition are likely to be a need, whereas behaviors associated with escaping a predator are unlikely to be a need. And again, I just want to make one really important point here. I'm talking about the predator escape behavior. That doesn't mean to say prey species don't need shelter. They need to feel they have the opportunity to make successful escapes. So even if animals in captivity are unlikely to benefit from running away from predators, it's important that we provide them the resources to do so. So what I hope this example illustrates is we don't necessarily have to replicate everything that is natural in an animal's life for it to have good welfare in captivity. I would argue the fact that boar in captivity don't have to run away from tigers is an example of how captivity can actually enhance their welfare. So we need to identify those elements that are essential to welfare, which enable us to optimize care without sacrificing the inherent benefits in providing those physical safeguards. And again, this just very conceptually summarizes that process that is inherent in this animal welfare priority identification system, or AURPIS methodology. So we convene a panel of a dozen or more experts, and we review the evolutionary significance, the motivational characteristics, the origin of the stimulus, whether there is evidence of impacts of the presence or absence of opportunities to express those behaviors. And all of this is algorithms are applied to this data, which gives us a measure of these welfare criteria. So we interrogate every single behavior and cognitive process, the mental processes of animals, by these 12 criteria. I'm going to very quickly run you through 3 assessments that we've undertaken for some species, in which we've actually undertaken 2 assessments each. We wanted to confirm there's a consistency in this methodology, so we assessed 3 species twice. The first assessment you'll probably be pleased to see was for bears, for the Asiatic black bear, and we undertook this with the Animals Asia team out in Vietnam. That was the first proto assessment that we undertook using this methodology. And then we tasked postgraduate veterinary students at the Royal Veterinary College to undertake the same assessment. Now, whilst they didn't have experience with Asiatic black bears, we literally provided them with every single published piece of work on the welfare and behavior of Asiatic black bears. And as you can see, there's this very consistent outcome in their identification of those welfare priorities, and the behaviors outlined in that red shape. They are the priority behaviors. They are the ones that we would encourage those responsible for Asiatic black bears to focus on. And there's a couple of points noticed here that fishing and swimming came as relatively low. Oh, let me just go back. And that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't provide a pool for your bears, but we just need to remember the natural environment for Asiatic black bears is typically more forested. We provide them, so captive black bears will certainly benefit from the firmer regulatory opportunities that pools provide. But also captive bears will inevitably have more spare time than their wild counterparts. They will be released from predator avoidance pressures, and so they will likely use pools and benefit from them. And so what this is suggesting is not that pools are bad, but if your resources are finite, and they always are, you might be better focusing resources for greater welfare returns by improving foraging opportunities. And we saw a similar story unfold in the assessment of Asian elephants. Now, pool use, provision of pools for elephants is mandated in husbandry guidelines around the world, but bathing and swimming were identified by both the captive elephant expert community and the in situ elephant expert community as relatively low priorities. And these can be immensely costly to deliver. You know, filtered pools for elephants are definitely expensive. And so what we're seeing from this AURPIS methodology is that current husbandry guidelines are not necessarily in step with the psychological needs of animals. There's another point worth very quickly noticing here, is that processing food was identified as important by captive carers because it's used as a means to offset the lack of foraging opportunities. So it was ranked far higher by the captive animal management community than it was by the in situ community, which it really illustrates the importance of having balanced expert groups in these assessment panels. Here's an assessment we undertook for animal tigers, again showing us consistency between the two assessments we undertook, and this is that data again summarized. And what we see here is the behaviors that are essential for survival, which are highlighted in red, are the most important from a psychological perspective, as well as being obviously essential from a physical perspective. And so we might be comfortable that we're ticking that box. You know, certainly we provide tigers the opportunity to drink, eat, and sleep. But what I want the take home for this to be is simply allowing the physical manifestation of that to be ticked is not necessarily enough to satisfy the psychological components of those behaviors and cognitive processes associated with that. And I think, you know, ultimately we see that in the provisioning of chow diets for tigers. We can tick that physical provisioning box, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it accommodates for those psychological aspects associated with that, which are really important. The behaviors highlighted in yellow are cognitive opportunities, or behaviors with a significant cognitive element, and those in green are ones that are predominantly cognitive. And again, just to illustrate the point about, you know, chow diets and the importance of foraging, what this assessment revealed was that foraging was, you know, a significantly higher priority than killing prey. And if we break the feeding associated behaviors down, again, we can see that information gathering is more important than stalking and chasing prey. And that's despite the fact that, you know, 79% of enrichment for carnivores focuses on artificial prey rather than information gathering. So what this assessment reveals for tigers, that the compression of a tiger's space is a risk factor for tigers because it reduces that scope for information gathering. But interestingly, the solution is not necessarily reliant upon adding more space, but it's reliant upon adding more cognitive opportunities. So for tigers and for many other species, including bears, no doubt, we need to think about dynamic, flexible spaces where choices shape outcomes, and we provide contingency for animals, where the choices and the actions of animals have real-world impacts in what they do and achieve. So I've talked briefly about different conceptions different conceptions of welfare across the animal welfare kind of stakeholder groups, and how we can start thinking about optimizing animal care strategies according to hedonistic definitions of welfare. But I now want to kind of illustrate how we can have different conceptions on animal welfare, even from within a single facility. So I think, again, just to you know, perhaps labor the point a little bit, when we look at welfare, we are not measuring welfare directly. We are considering elements that impact welfare and also things that result from the welfare status of animals. And whether we like it or not, that's overlaid by our intuitive perceptions of welfare. So what we're not actually doing is measuring welfare. We're making inferences about welfare based on inputs, outputs, and our perception. So I wanted to tease these apart within a facility to see how they relate to each other and how they ultimately relate to the welfare of animals. So I audited an entire facility And because we were looking at, in excess of 50,000 animals, it's certainly not possible to audit the welfare performance or the welfare status of individual animals. So we took the approach of assessing the welfare performance of habitats across that entire facility. And we did that by breaking the assessment down into three different groups of assessment. There was a holistic welfare assessment that was undertaken by animal care staff, and they were inducted into the process. And we were looking at behavioral freedoms. We were considering physiological and physical challenges associated with that environment. We were looking at the appropriateness of the social circumstances, the locomotor opportunities for animals, whether animals could run, fly, swim at maximum velocity, etc. And we were looking at the presence or absence of stereotypic behaviors. The veterinary team were allowed to establish their own criteria for auditing welfare, and they chose the ease of emergency and preventative care and metrics of morbidity and mortality. And we're also interested in visitor perceptions of both the happiness of animals within habitats, but also the health of animals within habitats. And so for each habitat, we had an average of 9 staff that assessed each habitat according to these 5 criteria across 133 habitats. And for the visitor assessments, we had 13,000 visitor assessments of 33 habitats, and a considerable amount of effort went into correcting for spurious button pressing. We switched the order in which good was, the good and the bad were faced on these iPads that were associated with enclosures, and people had to answer a number of questions correctly before we considered their ranking. So here in this graph, each point represents a habitat, and it comprises the average score of the 5 welfare measures undertaken by keepers plotted against the 3 scores provided by the veterinary team. And what we find is there's actually a significant inverse relationship between the holistic performance of habitat provided by the keepers and the veterinary performance assessment of each habitat, which really supports this conceptual model that I've shared with you, that there is this inherent tension between physical and psychological priorities. And ultimately what this illustrates is the things that animals need from their habitats to safeguard their welfare are not necessarily the same as what vets would like animals to have within their habitats to assist them in managing their physical well-being. And so this underlines that we are faced with a balance, and it's crucial we optimize all aspects of care rather than seeking to maximize any specific components. And here we see the relationship between the holistic welfare assessment along that bottom axis with various metrics relating to the visitor approval. And we can see the visitor assessments of animal happiness and also the visitor assessments of animal happiness combined with their assessments of health correlate significantly with the holistic keeper assessments of welfare, which suggests that actually visitors understand welfare perhaps better than we may have previously given them credit for, certainly at this facility at least. Also, really interestingly, visitor enjoyment correlates with holistic conceptions of welfare. So those habitats in which animal keepers believed animals had good welfare, visitors tended to enjoy those habitats more. And this is contrary to a widely reported narrative that animal welfare competes with commercial priorities, and also, from the other side, that public enjoyment compromises welfare. And this really kind of contradicts that. And in fact, I'd go as far to say that the commercial priorities of wild animal facilities that are open to the public are in fact dependent upon welfare performance according to these holistic and hedonistic conceptions of animal welfare. And to underline that point further, here is the relationship between visitors' perceptions of the happiness of animals within habitats and their enjoyment of those habitats. And I'm just going to point out that outlier towards the bottom. That was for penguins. So it appears that the visitors knew this habitat wasn't necessarily the best for the penguins, but nonetheless, they enjoyed seeing penguins. So in terms of some takeaways from this, very quick kind of run through on some of the, wider thinking about animal welfare, I'd encourage you to focus on hedonistic conceptions of animal welfare, and that's conceptions of animal welfare that are centered around the feelings of animals. I'd encourage you to establish consensus amongst your team on the welfare conceptions that you subscribe to, so that those aspects of care can be optimized, and to prioritize behaviors and cognitive processes that are most important to your animals, because not all behaviors and cognitive processes are equal. And I lifted this from the fantastic Bear Care Group website, and to help kind of navigate Elsa's points about providing bear stuff and what are bear reasons, is we need to think long and hard about what bear stuff matters and what bear reasons matters. I'd encourage you to challenge best practice. Don't assume current best practice are optimized for welfare. Our understanding of welfare is continually evolving. The needs of animals are not necessarily, or certainly on a kind of a human lifetime basis, but our understanding is evolving rapidly. So don't assume they're optimized for welfare. And following on from that, let's recognize that animal care is a journey, not a destination. You might feel you're doing the best that it is possible to do at this moment in time, but let's not get complacent. Let's continually evaluate what we do, and have the humility and indeed the confidence to strive to do better on a daily basis. And that premised on that is our ability to be, self-critical. Consider undertaking an objective welfare audit. It really helps with planning on an institution-wide basis, prioritizing, for example, facility developments. And it can often reveal surprises, particularly to facility directors, not necessarily to animal care staff, but there are always surprises in these audits. And when building new habitats or tackling specific welfare issues, consider undertaking one of these AUPIS assessments to help prioritize your care and help identify issues that are there. And finally, aim for peak welfare. I believe if we get that balance right, I think we should be optimistic about the capacity of captive environments to protect for welfare, but we might just need to think a little bit differently about what welfare is in order to achieve that. So that's it for me. I'll probably hand over to Angela now, and if anyone has any questions, very happy to take them.
Yes, thank you, Jake. That was great. A lot for us to absorb. So now we would like to open up questions from you guys. You can put everything in our chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time we have. We'll also look at doing some of these questions that we may not get to throughout Facebook for the next week. So first question for you, Jake, is how do you feel about when we're looking at staffing in our facilities? Should a welfare or behavioral manager have the same influence or be at equal to our vets or curators or all the other positions that we have?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think when I first started in the zoo world, I was pretty rare in that I was a a director of an animal care team that also had a welfare science background. And I think at that time, in 2020 plus years ago now, that was a pretty unique situation. And so I was empowered to bring welfare science, to apply that thinking to how we go about managing animals. And since then, there are an increasing number of welfare scientists in zoos, but I do feel they are, there's a lot of emphasis on monitoring welfare and navigating that relationship between how they influence welfare. I've not seen a formula yet. Doesn't mean to say it's not out there, but I'm not aware of a formula that's working effectively. I think ultimately we want to get to the point that that these welfare scientists are helping to inform the animal carers. And in that way, they're empowering the animal carriers to implement welfare science. I think it's really difficult for welfare scientists outside of those animal care teams to kind of come in and dictate. That's a really difficult kind of paradigm to navigate. But absolutely, welfare scientists within zoos need to be empowered to influence. And that's, yeah, so I don't know the answer to that. I mean, certainly, I think I don't see that welfare scientists should have any less influence than veterinarians, for sure. But you know, and that's where, you know, coming back to that point, the key is establishing consensus on what good looks like. And then we start having conversations about how to go about achieving good.
Okay. Question here about, do you have any data to show where enclosures have been designed for peak welfare fit into your charts about holistic versus visitor perceptions yet?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in a few, and you know, for example, speaking of bears, we designed the BC Wildlife Park's Commodity Bear facility based around these principles, and Woburn's facility for black bears and wolves was based around these kind of principles in an early, you know, that thinking was there. The process wasn't necessarily as there to underpin it in the way it is now. But, you know, what these kind of developments reveal is, for example, you know, we, in these habitats, we allow bears to dig their own bends. Mm-hmm. Because we, you know, what the process reveals is that, you know, den construction and everything associated with that is a highly motivated behavior. So we empower these animals, we allow these animals to dig these dens. And that comes with, you know, challenges that, you know, some zoo managers are uncomfortable with. The animals are off show. We can't necessarily monitor the well-being of these animals on a daily basis. And so that's where the tension really comes in. Are we willing and able to sacrifice, you know, those opportunities that a more simple captive environment affords to provide for these psychological priorities? And in particular with the Woburn Bear and Wolf facility, it's a mixed species exhibit. It's more complex, it's more dynamic. There's that inherent complexity of the interaction between the two species, but associated with that is absolutely the risk of negative interactions, of animals getting nipped, etc. And again, it's having the confidence and the framework in which we can kind of make those decisions in a balanced way to achieve, you know, optimal welfare.
Great. Looking at our veterinary staff, do you believe there's an opportunity either when they're already in a facility working with animal care or just in their training becoming a vet that we can incorporate more of the welfare process that we want?
I think it's really important, and again, I think there are regional differences. I think the North American kind of paradigm is somewhat different from the European and certainly the British paradigm in terms of vets. I mean, Gerald Durrell, the guy who started Jersey Zoo, famously said the most dangerous animal in the zoo was a vet. Personally, I think the architects, are vying for position, but there is a potentially slightly more flexible relationship in Europe with regards to veterinary professionals. And I think the crucial thing is, and it's getting vets to understand that it's about optimizing healthcare, not maximizing healthcare, because healthcare is an ingredient. It's not the goal. Optimal health, maximum longevity, I personally believe shouldn't be our goal. It's optimal welfare, and the pursuit of health and the pursuit of welfare can lead us down two very different paths. And I think coming back to that consensus within organizations, if we can understand that welfare is the goal and that health care is a component of that, we can start having a more balanced approach. And sometimes the best thing to do in terms of healthcare is actually nothing. It's taking that step back. And but these changes don't happen overnight. They're kind of big cultural shifts, as we've seen. The American Veterinary Medical Association, every North American vet will be a member of that, and that's an organization that felt that it was better to stop farm animals standing up and turning around because it allowed them to protect them from disease. And so there's a massive mindset shift that needs to occur to kind of deliver that optimal welfare.
Yeah, absolutely. A question shifting back to cetaceans. Do you think there is an opportunity to apply this method and find their peak welfare? Or, are we looking at some species that we just can't?
I mean, theoretically, I think anything's possible. Genuinely, I think it comes down to practicalities. So as an example with tigers, I don't think we need to replicate the vast landscape that tigers range upon. And if you look at actually tigers, where prey density is high, they range very little. In areas in India, the home range of tigers can be 1 or 2 square kilometers. In Siberia, they can be, literally thousands of square kilometers where prey density is smaller. So there is a flexibility in the needs of animals in terms of the physical environment, but the cognitive opportunities, whether you're a tiger at 10,000 square kilometers or 2 square kilometers, are the same. And we need to replicate those. So I believe theoretically it's possible to provide for those needs. It just becomes practically very difficult with big animals, particularly marine mammals like cetaceans, because to provide and elephants are difficult, but the cost of providing 20 acres of natural landscape is infinitely less than the cost of providing 20 acres of of aquatic space, with all the acoustic complications that go with it. So I haven't undertaken an AURPIS assessment for cetaceans. We've talked around this subject for a number of years, and because of the sensitivities around it, there's been a reluctance to undertake that assessment. But I think a lot of the conversations about cetaceans have been based around an intuitive sense of what is right or wrong, and I think that whole conversation would benefit from an objective review of what's important to cetaceans, forming the basis of conversations about whether or not that is practically possible.
Okay. Yeah. All right, we're going to do one more question here. And do you have suggestions on how zoos can do welfare in their collection planning at that early on stage, and it's a priority over potential conservation, education, research, all the other aspects that go into zoos?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think animal welfare needs to be, I think in terms of collection planning for zoos, we need to look at, the conservation impact of what we're doing. We need to look at the affordability of what we're doing. And there are certain nice to haves. It's great to have endangered species. It's great to have exciting species, but absolutely, if we feel we can't maintain welfare, I think, that decision tree should be a clear cut off no. And so I think, when we talk about the 11 urban zoos that held polar bears in the UK in the 80s and 90s, some might consider that a failure, that they gave up and they gave into the anti-zoo lobby. I applaud those institutions for recognizing the difficulties in maintaining those species in that environment and making the right decisions. And that is exactly what I think we need to do. The audit process that I've undertaken here, and I can share, I can see Simon's asking that, I can share a slide with Simon. We actually create a traffic light system where we can rank habitats according to, from red to green based on their welfare performance, and we can overlay that on maps of existing facilities to show where we need to focus new developments. So absolutely, welfare provisioning and the ability to provide welfare, I think is the central tenet of collection planning and master planning, both for existing zoos and new zoos. I've always said for zoos that conservation is our mandate, but animal welfare is our license to operate, and we can't even attempt conservation without getting welfare right.
Absolutely. Jake, this has been great. Thank you so much for participating with us today. And everyone that's been listening and engaging us with your questions, please continue to do so through Facebook this week. And I will poke Jake throughout the week and get his responses. And we hope you guys can join us on our next webinar, which is September 27th. You can go to our website. That'll be about a wild approach to bear enrichment with Kyle Branting-Jones. And we've got a few more that you can find on our website as well. If you really enjoyed this and you want to support the Bear Care Group, check out our website. We have a lot of opportunities, from Amazon Smile, selecting us as your charity, to purchasing merchandise through Cafe Press, or you can do donation through PayPal. We are looking for development of our next conference and workshops as well. So stay tuned for Facebook and our websites for more information about that. Thank you guys all for participating. Hope to have you guys at our next one as well. Appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Just very quickly, if anyone has any specific kind of questions or queries they want to follow up on, it's jake@carefortherare.com. Please feel free to reach out, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, guys.